So today we're here to talk about what we've called being locked up in lockdown and effectively how the courts are dealing with breaches of injunction, particularly arrests. Now I'm going to hand over to Aline, who's going to take us through how the courts were dealing with things in the old halcyon days before lockdown.
Thank you, Kirsty. Yes, thank you for that. As Kirsty said there, it was pre-lockdown. Arrests were quite straightforward in some respects, in that the defendant would be arrested, the defendant would be taken to the cells or even taken directly to court. At some point, the claimant would be informed of the arrest, or the police would inform the advocates directly. Because, as you know, the injunctions have our details on them. And then almost always, the hearings would take place in person at court. So pre-lockdown, it was still mad. it's no doubt. However, there was some structure to it. But of course, we're now in the midst of a lockdown. And I'm going to hand back over to Kirsty, who's going to explain how things seem to have changed.
Thanks, Al. So obviously with the way society's changed, the lockdown has changed the way that breaches of injunction are being dealt with. And just to give you an idea of how it's changed, not just the area of law that we deal with, but the justice system across the board. I did a bit of research before this session, and 157 courts across England and Wales have remained open as priority courts, but that's magistrates' courts, crown courts and county courts. And in total, 58% of all courts are closed at the moment, and those were courts that were functioning before the coronavirus pandemic. As well as that, the definition of what urgent business is and the types of hearings that courts are now prioritising has also changed. And Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunals Service updated their priorities for hearings to be dealt with during the pandemic on the 24th of April as part of the court-wide coronavirus update. And priority one work, and that's work that's been identified as work that must be done by the courts during the coronavirus pandemic. Right at the very top of the list is committals, so that's arrest, that's the lockup that we're dealing with, the lockup part of lockup in lockdown. Also included in that list, antisocial behaviour injunctions. So it's very, very clear that even while society may look very different, large parts of society and life as we know it are closed down. Antisocial behaviour, dealing with ASB and dealing with breaches of injunction is an absolute priority for the courts during lockdown. So it's all well and good knowing that the courts are going to deal with arrests, but how are they going to conduct them? We know in times of social distancing, things look very different. We're encouraged to have as little contact with one another as possible. Well, the answer to that is there isn't one definitive answer, and every court is dealing with things and dealing with hearings differently. So, for example, in Manchester Court and in Preston Court, they're still dealing with arrests face to face. They will socially distance you when you go into the court. You're socially distanced even as you go through security, and great care is taken to keep 2 metres apart. If you contrast that with, for example, Nottingham County Court are having you dial in and do hearings by telephone. And then if we contrast that again with Bristol and other courts further down south, hearings have been done there by Skype. They actually worked quite well. The defendant remained in police custody in a police, well, not a cell, but a room in the police station, and the hearing was conducted there. So I was on Skype, the judge was on Skype, I think at home. It looked as though he was sat in his study at one of the hearings, and then the defendant was sat in the police station. So each court is making their own decisions. We are classed as key workers, so we can go. We will attend these hearings. We'd much rather go and make representations for clients than miss out. So we then get to the hearing, and however it's being conducted, whether it's by telephone, whether it's by Skype, whether it's in person, the ideal, obviously, for us, if it's a nailed-on breach, if you like, if it looks to be a certain breach, the defendant admits it and we can deal with it and all go home. But if they don't admit the breach and we need to file further evidence, well, then there's another potential issue that we could encounter. Now, CPR 81, and that's the part in the civil procedure rules that governs contempt of court and committal proceedings, states that any applications to commit a defendant to prison for breach of injunction must be accompanied by affidavits. And then we encounter the problem, well, how are we going to get affidavits sworn when we're socially distancing? Many courts are closed to the public, even if they are open for court hearings. It's only for parties to proceedings. So what are we going to do? Well, there is some assistance, again, in the civil procedure rules, but that's in practice direction 81.6.2. And that says, and I'm going to read from it, the court may waive any procedural defect in a committal application if it's satisfied that there's no injustice caused to the respondent by the defect. So in other words, if you're going to include all the information in a witness statement that you would include in an affidavit, and the only difference is that the slight form in the way that the evidence is produced to the court and not the content of it, and there's very little, if any, prejudice to the defendants, and so those witness statements will be allowed. There is also case law on this point. In reality, I've been speaking to opponents at court. I've been agreeing that we allow witness statements instead of affidavits. I've not met any resistance to that in the current climate. The court expects the parties to really cooperate and work with one another as best they can. If there is any resistance, though, there is a case. It's Quantum Tuning Limited and Sam White. If anybody would like further details of that and any advice on that, Aleem or I will be happy to give those after this session. But essentially, there aren't any exact rules that I've really come across, but I haven't encountered any resistance either to trying to deal with hearings. Everybody seems to be dealing with it very practically, very pragmatically, and just trying to move hearings on as best we can. I'm just going to hand over to Al now to see if he's got anything to add in relation to how he thinks the courts are dealing with matters. I've got my own views as well. I thought I'd hand over to Al just so you don't get bored of the sound of my voice.
Thank you, Kirsty. Yes, just to add to what Kirsty said there, recent experiences have dictated that our opponents and the courts are allowing us to make applications by way of witness statements rather than affidavits. We've made, I think, 3 or 4 recently, which have gone out in the last few weeks, and they've been returned to us with hearing dates without any issues whatsoever. In the past, the court staff would just return the affidavit attached to it. So there has been a change there in how the courts are viewing and dealing with committal applications. So that's the recent experiences. In terms of sentencing, now, Kirsty may well concur with me here that we've noticed a distinct lack of prison time for defendants who are breaching injunctions, especially. I mean, for a first breach, you can understand how the court may be unwilling to give anybody any prison time. I mean, even a second or third, they may well not give anybody any prison time, but you start creeping towards suspended sentences and then actual custodial sentences. What we've noticed recently, and the trend seems to be that the courts are very reluctant at the moment to send anybody to prison. Now, a hearing that I did only a couple of weeks ago, the judge was very open and honest about this. And what she said was, and it was a circuit judge as well, and what she said was, there are reports that prisoners are being held for up to 23 hours a day in their cells. So rather than being allowed out and being allowed in communal areas and doing whatever they normally do, they're being held in their cells for up to 23 hours a day because of the coronavirus. And the judge was very clear that whilst contempt of court is a serious matter, does she want to, on that particular occasion, send somebody to prison to spend up to 23 hours a day in prison, in his cell? And as it turned out, the matter was adjourned. But the point is that this was a circuit judge, and she was very honest about not wanting to send anybody to prison at the moment. So we have noticed a bit of a trend of judges being unwilling to make or pass custodial sentences. And just to add to arrests generally, ties in with sentencing. It's probably a good idea for us all just to be mindful and very selective about when we ask the police to make arrests. Now, of course, there are occasions where the police will arrest somebody for breach of an injunction because that person has breached the injunction and then they were called out and they have to do their jobs. But if you're in a position whereby you have a good relationship with your local police, and you can actually say so-and-so has breached their injunction, can you go out and arrest them? Be selective about when you ask the police to go out and arrest. Avoid evenings or nights. We always find that if an arrest can take place first thing in the morning, more often than not, a court will find time to hear and deal with the matter that day. So we always find that that's easier. Now, of course, like I said, the police may well go and arrest somebody the night before or the day before, and you've got to deal with it. But you start creeping towards, well, when was the arrest? What time did the arrest take place? When did the 24-hour clock start? And so we always find that it's always a good idea to get in touch with your local police and say, right, so-and-so needs to be arrested. Arrange a date and ask them to go early in the morning. And chances are you've got a better chance of arresting somebody earlier in the morning as well whilst they're still in bed than at any other time of the day. So it tends to work quite well. So that's just sentences, that's just arrests in general. And on that point as well, it's always a good idea, we found, that to avoid arrests even at the weekends. Now, I mean, this applied pre-lockdown. It applies in the midst of this current lockdown, and it'll apply post-lockdown as well, which is, as far as possible, avoid a weekend arrest. Yes, if there is an arrest, if the police make an arrest, then it has to be dealt with, and we will be on hand. We have a weekend rota, and somebody will always be on hand to deal with that. But if possible, avoid a weekend arrest, or ask your local bobbies to pick somebody up during the week, purely and simply because if there's an arrest late on Friday, it will be heard on the Saturday. If it's Saturday late, then it'll swing over to Monday. But if there's an arrest on Friday, it will be heard on the Saturday. And the problem that you have is the court out of hours service will find a judge, pretty much any judge that they can find, is willing to deal with the matter on a Saturday. And the judge will often have absolutely no idea about the file, will have read very little by way of paperwork, may not even have access to the court file. We don't know what kind of access the judges have. Might not have had any chance to prepare, even if they have got the file. And so what you often find is an arrest at a weekend, which is dealt with, invariably is just adjourned to be heard during the week by one of the resident judges of the court. Now, the problem with that is, of course, you've just incurred expense for no reason. For an arrest that could have been dealt with Monday to Friday, it just so happened to be dealt with at the weekend, but adjourned, and you've incurred cost. So just on the point of arrest, generally, be selective about when arrests take place and try to avoid weekend arrests. I'll now hand back over to Kirsty.
Yeah, thanks, Al. Again, just to sort of reinforce what Aline was saying about timing of arrest, that can be really, really crucial. And in fact, I've found on one of my recent cases that a defendant was arrested. The local police station were really not very keen at all to have prisoners there where they could avoid it, again, because of the social distancing measures that are in place. And so the defendant was then de-arrested, re-arrested at a time when the court was open, and then conveyed straight to the court. So that really is something to think about. Also, just to say that however a hearing is going to be dealt with, whether it's going to be dealt with over the phone, whether it's going to be dealt with by Skype, whether Aleem and I have got to pick up our car keys and go out, we will go and we will deal with these hearings. And I think we've just had to work with the courts and be as flexible really as the courts have been, and we certainly haven't had any issues in doing that. We're just all having to really adapt to these very strange times. I wondered, unless Salim's got anything else to add, if there were any questions that anybody had, or any of the attendees wanted to share any experiences that they had. Is there anything you wanted to add, Al?
Yeah, I mean, just generally, just to make the point that the courts are still dealing with antisocial behaviour injunctions, are still dealing with arrests. And I think the few questions that we've had prior to today have been about how the courts are dealing with them now. As I've said, they are dealing with them, but they're just not dealing with them in person. So there is a reliance on Skype. There is a reliance on telephone hearings. There's very few hearings that are taking place in person, and where they are taking place in person, as Kirsty said earlier, they're taking place in bigger courts where the courts can operate social distancing measures. And so I think that answers the questions that we had prior to today's session, which is how are the courts currently dealing with things. But in conclusion, arrests are taking priority. So as I said, if there is an arrest early in the morning, it will be heard that day. Everyone knows there's a 24-hour time limit from the arrest, and the arrests are taking priority over and above pretty much everything else at the moment, as Kirsty alluded to. So the court will find a way of dealing with it. So arrest early in the day, court will deal with it that day. But just in generally, yes, there has been a change. The coronavirus and the current pandemic has affected how arrests are dealt with, but they are being dealt with. Kirsty, I think there's a question here.
Do you want to read it out, Al? I can't see it on my screen.
Yeah. Question is, Claire Wakefield, thank you, Claire. We got an 8-day remand in custody today for a second breach pending a psych test. Issues around whether a psychiatrist will go to prison. It's a good question. Will a psych go to prison to see somebody, Kirsty?
That will very much depend on the psychiatrist, I would imagine, whether they themselves have got any underlying health issues, and we're finding that's affecting people where ordinarily you might instruct somebody. I've had counsel with the same sorts of issues sometimes as well. If the person themselves feels that they're medically fit, capable, not going to endanger anybody else, then they may decide they're okay to go to the prison and do it themselves, depending on the prison rules as well. I have had psychiatrists do desk reports in the past, so it might be that they just ask for medical records, look at whether any mental health issues have been identified, look at any injunction orders, and try and do a desk report that way, and then just limit any conclusions to say they've not had the opportunity to see the prisoner. But that, I imagine, will be something that a psychiatrist decides on a personal basis.
And just to add to that, yes, I mean, I know one particular defendant firm in Manchester who are happily instructing a psych, and the psych is conducting all of his appointments over the telephone. So even if somebody is in prison, as long as arrangements are made with the prison service, and I know that's not easy. I know there are difficulties dealing with the prison service, but you've just got to persevere. The prison service will have a facility whereby they can put the defendant on the other end of the phone with a psych, and the psych can do what he needs to do and put the relevant questions to the defendant and prepare his report.
I think there's another question, Al. I've just seen this pop up from Elizabeth Chan.
Elizabeth.
Hi Elizabeth, thanks for your question. Hi, I've just dealt with a committal following arrest today at Liverpool, where the judge had expected me to have completed Form N78, notice to show good reason why an order for your committal to prison should not be made. I must admit I've never known this to be requested before, and wondered if this is something that you do routinely. I'll go first if you don't mind, Al, and then if you want to chip in with anything. The answer is, Elizabeth, I always used to do and complete a Form N78, and then I stopped doing so. And the reason for that is there was a challenge, and if you leave it with me, I will locate the case law for you. But there were certainly some local challenges to say that the Form N78 actually was not compatible with the defendant's human rights. And the reason for that is that if you look at the Form N78 and how it's to be completed, it puts the onus on the defendant to say why they shouldn't go to prison, when actually in committal proceedings, as we all know, it's for the claimant to prove beyond a reasonable doubt why the defendant should go to prison. So there were some human rights challenges, and that's why the court service really across the board abandoned Form N78, and I don't use them anymore, haven't done for some time. So when I do an application to commit, I just do it on the N244 with a schedule of allegations and obviously a copy of the injunction and relevant evidence to be attached to it. Al, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add to that.
Thanks, Kirst. Yeah, no, absolutely spot on. I haven't done one for any of the hearings that I've done recently, and it's a while. Let's be honest, it's a while since I turned up at court with one, which we'd completed, and in any event as well, as you said, the challenges that you got from it, well, it wasn't worth it, if essentially, and so we just stopped doing them. You will get the odd judge. Who, as today, Elizabeth, as you discovered, will request the N78, but you've just got to be clear that it's not something that's routinely done. But if the judge insists, then of course it's something that you need to look into.
I'm glad it makes you feel better. Yeah, as I say, just to add to that, Elizabeth, I think you really can't shift the burden, as we've said, and if a judge asks you that in the future, it's for you as the claimant, and you have to prove everything beyond reasonable doubt. Service of the injunction. I've had trials on whether a defendant's been served with an injunction before we even got to allegations before now. We've got to prove every element of our case beyond a reasonable doubt. So it shouldn't be for the defendant to have to turn up and say, this is why I shouldn't go to prison. He can turn up, as we know, he still has the right to silence. He can turn up and say nothing. And if you as a claimant don't prove your case, he doesn't go to prison. So that really hopefully should sort of settle that for you. Were there any other questions, or did anybody else? Oh, here we go. We've got another question from Kay Stephen. Thanks for the question, Kay. Do you find that there are difficulties with the courts, and particularly magistrates, receiving information from the police through their Libra system, and therefore the case doesn't appear on their court list? Courts won't deal with the matter unless it appears on the system. I've had problems with this at Bradford Mags with youth arrests. How do courts deal with arrests? I mean, that can be a lottery, can't it? Certainly from my perspective, some courts are very slick. The operation is fantastic. There's a set protocol with the local police and everybody knows what they're doing. Other courts you go to and nobody seems to have even heard of the fact that somebody can be arrested for a breach of injunction. I once phoned an arresting officer after he'd left me a message, and the police, whoever it was that answered the phone, the call handler, refused to put me through because they thought I was a member of the press. So you can hit barriers at every turn. I haven't known that specifically in relation to the Libra system, but really I think attending court user groups, and if there are local protocols that you can get involved in or find out if there are any that are in existence and then add to them, that really is the first step, I think. Aleem and I are involved in some and in some court user groups, the main ones that we go to, and that does make the process smoother. And then, excuse me, if there are any issues, we can then feed that into the court user group, feed that into the protocol, and hopefully that can iron them out. So I would suggest that's your first port of call. Al, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely, Kirsty, you're right. There will be a user group. Bradford, the courts in Bradford, I'm pretty certain that there is a court users group in Bradford. Failing that, write a letter to the court manager. Very straightforward, and I know it's not something that we ever think of doing, even though all our letters go out in the post addressed to the court manager, but send a direct letter to the court manager and explain the issue, and explain that you're having these issues, and the police are having these issues with the Libra system. Things aren't appearing on the list, and ask for a meeting. And that's what the court manager is there. The court manager is there to manage the court. And it's these types of issues that you would take up with the court manager, and hopefully the court manager would expect these types of issues to be taken up with him or her. I think that's all of the questions now. If anybody's got any more questions,
just give it a minute or two. Just give it a minute or two, sorry, Al, in case there are any others. As we've said, if anybody wants to sort of raise anything, if you've not had chance or you're too shy to put it in the chat, that's absolutely fine. I'm sure you've got our contact details, and they're on the invite anyway, I think. So perhaps if we give it another minute or so, and then if not. I think we'll wrap things up. I think I would say from a personal perspective, I'm not surprised that breaches of injunction are being dealt with because of the seriousness of them. You know, court orders being breached, breach of orders being enforced has always been something that the courts have been very, very hot on. I think what surprised me the most is how quickly some courts have adapted actually to dealing with things remotely, and it's perhaps some of the courts that initially I would have said were perhaps a bit slower to embrace newer practices and newer technologies have been the ones that have really surprised me and have come to the forefront and have really turned things around very quickly. So I think it just goes to show you that you never really know your court until you're in a coronavirus pandemic.
And I think whilst we're just waiting for any more questions, just something to add. There is apparently a survey that's going to go out straight after this. So please fill the survey in and tell everybody how great we are. But otherwise, I think we've had no further questions, Kirsty.
I think that's everything, yeah.
Well, there we go. Everybody, thank you for attending today. We've kept it short and sweet, but as Kirsty said, please feel free to drop us an email. Our details are on the email that went out. Pick up the phone, have a chat with us. Drop us an email. Just get in touch. We're always happy to take time out and speak to you, and hopefully point you in the right direction if you're struggling with something. Thank you.
Thank you.